My honor to welcome everybody to the 2025 Clinical Trials Science Forum from Actinogen and called The Critical Importance of Preparing for Commercialization. And we have with us today Dr. Dana Hilt, our Chief Medical Officer, Andy Udell, Chief Commercial Officer, and our guest Associate Professor Michael Woodward, Head of Dementia Research at the Austin Health and a very experienced Alzheimer's disease researcher. Welcome, everybody. We have here our usual disclaimer, which can be read on the slide deck that was sent out this morning as an ASX announcement. We will be making forward-looking statements as usual. And just briefly for the Q&A, please, if you have a question, type your question in the Q&A window and hit enter to submit your message. We will take some questions during the presentation and we will have a break in the middle of the presentation to have some panel discussion and answer a few questions, but most of the questions will be kept to the end, and hopefully we'll leave plenty of time for a robust Q&A at the end. And just to summarize what we're going to talk about, we're preparing for Xanamem's success. You'll hear that existing Alzheimer's treatments are clearly inadequate. It is exciting that some progress has been made in recent years, but a lot is needed, and newer next generation Alzheimer's treatments are coming, Xanamem included. And our oral once-a-day Xanamem is one of the few late-stage and promising treatments with a novel mechanism. And you'll hear the panelists talk about the context for the whole field, including Xanamem. And Andy will spend some time explaining why the time to prepare for Xanamem's marketing and product launch is now. It's important to design the phase 3 correctly, not just to get a good result, but to answer the questions and the needs for payers, for governments, as well as for patients and doctors. And so with that, I will hand over to Dr. Hilt, who will take us through the Alzheimer's disease treatment landscape.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with you all today and to talk about this topic. Let's go to the next slide. So we'll jump right into it with the depiction of the effect of the two recently approved, or over the last couple of years, approved monoclonal antibodies to amyloid, lecanemab and donanemab. Now, this is a little bit of a complex slide. What I'm showing here is over time, 18 months on the x-axis. In the solid blue line, you see a decrement in patients on placebo. This is a worsening of their Alzheimer's disease. It's characterized and measured by a decrease in a scale called the CDR sum of boxes, which is shown on the y-axis, CDR-SB. That's going down. Now, the blue, shaded blue area is a treatment effect, because the line above the placebo line is the treatment effect of lecanemab or donanemab. Now, these monoclonal antibodies over a year and a half of treatment produce about a half a point slowing in the rate of decline in patients with mild Alzheimer's disease. Now, that is a very modest treatment benefit. The literature teaches us that the minimal clinical important difference, the MCID, of the CDR sum of boxes is actually 1 to 2 points. So this difference is actually not even at the level of the minimal clinical important difference, but it is a difference. It's a first step in the treatment of this disease, and it's exciting. The statistical significance in these trials was very robust because the trials are very large. The key point, though, here is the purple wedge above that. That's the unmet clinical need, that we need to develop new therapies to treat. And because both lecanemab and donanemab quantitatively remove amyloid, it is unlikely that newer amyloid therapies, while they may be safer, may be able to do this more rapidly, probably not going to have a more robust treatment effect. And so the field has now realized this and are turning their attentions to other mechanisms, other targets to try to add to this, to try to increase the treatment benefit for patients. We go to the next slide. And at the recent Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease Congress, there was a interesting question that was asked of a large group, about 2,000 attendees. Which of the following is the greatest barrier and challenging to implementing these antibody therapies or amyloid therapies in early AD? And you can see there's the interest, willingness of clinicians to treat patients. The workup is quite extensive with PET scans, some cases CSF analyses, and multiple MRIs to monitor therapy. The resources and workflows needed to deliver infusion therapies, a lot of neurology practices are not suited for this, and to monitor something called ARIA, A-R-I-A, which is a potentially serious side effects of giving these monoclonal antibodies to patients with Alzheimer's disease. It causes cerebral edema or swelling of the brain, causes bleeding, hemorrhage, and some of these cases have been fatal. And so the patient and the clinician have to together weigh the potential benefits of this therapy. In many areas, these drugs are not yet approved. In Australia, they're not yet approved. They have partial approval in the UK and Europe. They're approved in the United States. But we're seeing, because of these barriers, the uptake of these medications has been less than anticipated. So all of these things together present challenges. Challenges administration, very modest treatment effect, safety concerns, and not listed there is a need to have multiple MRIs and monitoring, very close monitoring and treating these patients. So these are an advance, clearly, but there is clearly a need for other additional non-amyloid directed therapies, non-tau directed therapies. Next, please. This is a panel from Jeff Cummings' summary of drugs in development in Alzheimer's disease. If you're interested in this, this is on the left is a panel from the 2024 publication. His new paper, which we saw at the AD/PD Congress, he went over these data, is in press and will be coming out. So what is shown here is a list of different targets and now being targeted in Alzheimer's disease therapy. It's no longer just amyloid and tau. There's a whole series of different types of targets that biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies and researchers are focusing on, from growth factors, metabolism, new approaches to modulating neurotransmitter tone, oxidative stress, vasculature. Very important is the area of neuroinflammation. Also very important is the area of a ApoE4 gene, which is a significant AD genetic risk factor. And while the mechanism by which this increases AD risk is not clear, it seems to may facilitate amyloid deposition and promote inflammation. A lot of these things go back to neuroinflammation as a very important target that is really burgeoning in the focus of many groups. And as we have more advances in genetics and molecular and cellular biology, we are finally, after many years of working on this, we're having additional insights into the pathogenesis and factors which are really causing Alzheimer's disease. And this is really now starting to inform a more intelligent selection, identification of targets, and new mechanism. And Xanamem is one of these drugs with the new mechanism. It's blocking cortisol production in the brain. And this is, the literature supports that this could have an impact then on patients with Alzheimer's disease and other neuropsychiatric conditions. Next, please. And this also was at the recent AD/PD meeting. And this is Dr. Howard Fillet, who's the founder and the chief scientific officers of the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Fund. Anti-amyloid therapies, and these are the comments that he made at the meeting, have some benefit in slow disease progress by perhaps 25%, but they have the risks that I've already mentioned: safety risk, IV administration, operational logistic challenges, high costs, and there's significant unmet medical need beyond amyloid and tau. So the ADDF invests in early stage and mid stage drug development for Alzheimer's disease. And they have a variety of portfolios you can see behind Dr. Phillip there on the screen of different types of targets which represent these different areas that I had a few slides ago. And as he mentioned in this meeting a few weeks ago, inflammation has had a big increase in interest. That also actually has a potential tie to Xanamem because cortisol may have pro-neuroinflammatory effects in the nervous system. So blocking cortisol production may be beneficial. Next, please. And so Xanamem, the drug that we're working on, is a novel 11-beta-HSD1 inhibitor. Well, what does that mean? It basically means that it blocks cortisol production in the brain. To date, it has been safe, well tolerated. It's given orally once a day. And brain cortisol has really been proposed as a potential pathogen or pathogenetic mechanism in a variety of neuropsychiatric conditions, including Alzheimer's disease. This drug gets into the brain, we've demonstrated that, and it leaves systemic cortisol at a normal level, just decreases cortisol production in the brain and to some degree the liver and adipose tissue. Now you need normal systemic cortisol to deal with stresses that you encounter. So this is a unique way to target the cortisol that is detrimental to the brain. We've had positive initial results then in two separate trials, one in Alzheimer's disease, I'll talk a little bit about, and a separate trial we won't have much time to talk about today in major depressive disorder. And both of these are very large clinical and commercial opportunities. There's no other brain penetrant cortisol controlling drug in development. These are both large markets, and there's unmet medical need here, as I've already mentioned. Next, please. And so this Xanamem, as I mentioned, blocks cortisol production in the brain. So a simple way to think about this is the reduction of the stress response in the brain while leaving the body's cortisol level and adrenal gland function unchanged. So these can be grouped perhaps into a number of different categories of responses. The cortisol effect in the brain may be a touch on many different systems in the brain. There may be rapid biochemical changes, enzymatic changes, neurotransmitter changes, which may occur over hours to days, and that may decrease this stress response, inflammation, resetting neurotransmitter balance and tone. And there may be slower changes that may take some days or weeks even, or longer to produce an effect. And these may lead to improving neural circuitry, maybe even regeneration of neural cells, and to retune the brain to a better level of function. Next, please. So the last couple of slides from my section, I'm going to talk about the first trial that we did some years ago now with in patients with Alzheimer's disease. And these are patients that had clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And we looked back and determined that the patients that had a clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease plus positive p-tau 181, which is a biomarker which picks out patients that for sure have Alzheimer's disease, but also patients that are more likely to progress. And over this 3-month trial, you can see in the gray line the decrement in the patient's function. This is the same CDR sum of box measure I showed you before. And even over 3 months, there's a significant decline in the level of function in these patients. Where in the solid purple line is the patients on Xanamem, and they had much less of a decline. So these data are very exciting to us, and these are the data that we use to then design the next study, which is a much larger, longer, more comprehensive study. Next slide, please. This is the Xanamem study that's now ongoing in Australia and the United States, and we're enrolling patients for 9 months of treatment, not just 3, but 9 months of treatment. And it's going to be patients who have a clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's plus positive p-tau elevation. Then they'll be randomized to either 10 milligrams of Xanamem or placebo. And we'll be looking at the CDR sum of boxes, which I've already mentioned, and other important clinical secondary endpoints. This is being conducted at 35 centers in Australia and the United States. And we plan an interim analysis when approximately 100 people complete 24 weeks, which may be around the end of this year. Next, please. So with that background on some of the present treatments in Alzheimer's disease, plus an introduction to Xanamem and some of the data, I would like to give the speaker staff now to Professor Michael Woodward from the Austin Health in Melbourne. Dr. Woodward is a geriatrician, head of the Dementia Research Unit, which is extremely active in Alzheimer's disease research, but also in many conditions that impact geriatric patients. And Dr. Woodward is going to tell us a little bit about what Austin Health does and his perspective on the drug development status and landscape in Alzheimer's disease. So we're very pleased, Michael, to have you. Please take it away.
Thank you, Dana, and thanks to everybody online. So this is our Austin Medical and Cognitive Research Unit, where most of our research is being done on drugs for Alzheimer's disease in the mild cognitive impairment and in the early dementia stage. We're led by geriatricians. We have dedicated coordinators who are largely nurses, neuropsychologists, administrative staff. We're probably the largest such research centre in the Southern Hemisphere at the moment. And we have a number of collaborations which are listed there. Most research really does need to have networks, as you'd be aware, I'm sure. Next slide. We were established back in 1993. So far, we've done over 200 clinical trials with 120 individual compounds, investigational products. And most of these are multi-center, but some of them are investigator-initiated. Some of them we concentrate on Australia-developed drugs, as is Xanamem, although initially from Edinburgh, but most of the work has been done in Australia since. Most of these trials we've done at phase 1, 2, and 3. We did the early phase studies with this drug, which has the name now of emustadostat, as you can see there. And I've been the national principal investigator. We're also involved in the latest phase 3 study that Dana spoke about. In fact, we had 2 patients screened as eligible yesterday. And we've had some successes with drugs that do work, such as the monoclonal antibodies, lecanemab and donanemab, and we've still got ongoing trials with those drugs, and new generation monoclonal antibodies as well. There's another oral drug called blarcamesine that's recently been published, and we've been involved in that study as well. So we're one of only about 20 clinical trial sites in Australia that are predominantly conducting Alzheimer's research. And as you heard from Dana, most of those studies are also involved in the Xanamem-Xanamem study. Next, please. Now, from my perspective, this is really important work. I'm not doing this just because it's my job. I'm doing it because I have a passion. I have a mother who sadly died with Alzheimer's disease recently, and many of us I know are touched by people with Alzheimer's disease, either in our family or in our friendship groups, our social groups. There are the numbers there. That's worldwide. In Australia, about 500,000 people have dementia currently. But you've got to realise that this is just dementia. There's also the mild cognitive impairment stage, also known as prodromal Alzheimer's or prodromal other dementias, and that's twice as many. And it's not really mild, it's called mild cognitive impairment, but it significantly impacts on a person's cognition, also can affect their behaviour and their quality of life. So it's a really important issue both worldwide and locally here in Australia. Current therapies are only have limited efficacy. Drugs like the cholinesterase inhibitors, donepezil, galantamine and rivastigmine, and the glutamatergic acting drugs such as memantine, they've been around for a quarter of a century. And look, the analogy really is, it's like having a serious illness and taking Panadol. They have mild symptomatic benefits. They're not always well tolerated. We need something that's going to work at a more fundamental area. Now, it might not be realistic to expect a moderately demented person to turn back the clock, but we should slow down disease progression. And in fact, if we start at an earlier stage in the disease process, mild cognitive impairment, or even earlier, the preclinical stage where the pathology is building up but there are not yet symptoms, we may be able to slow progression to the next stage. So from preclinical to mild cognitive impairment, or from mild cognitive impairment to dementia. That's really where we're aiming in much of our research here. Next slide, please. And we've done this before. This is not a new trail. I've been around in the area of medicine as a doctor since the late 1970s. And when I started, cancer was largely untreatable. Cures were limited. I remember doing my pediatric rotation and was told that ALL, the common childhood form of leukemia, was almost universally fatal. And now it's almost rarely fatal. There was a conspiracy of silence around cancer. People didn't want to talk about it if they had it. They didn't want their parents to know they had cancer. They didn't want the person who had cancer to be told they had cancer. I can't remember how many times I was told, don't tell the patient doctor that they've got cancer, that'll kill them. But now we talk about our breast cancer, our prostate cancer, because we're more comfortable with it. Treatments and cures are now the norm, as is symptomatic treatment. And we also have much better prevention. Now, that's where we're heading with other diseases now, such as Alzheimer's disease. Another example is heart failure. In the 1980s, very few treatment options, but now we have coronary interventions, the angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, risk factor modification. People are not shy to talk about their heart attack or their angina or other heart disease because they're, again, effective preventions and treatments. Rheumatoid arthritis. I remember seeing patients in the 80s that almost universally had terribly deformed hands. They couldn't use buttons. They couldn't hold knives and forks. The therapies then were terribly ineffective and toxic. Drugs like gold. We just don't see those rheumatoid hands now that we have what we call disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs. So the brain too is the next frontier. It's a hard nut to crack if you exclude the pun, but we're making progress. Multiple sclerosis is a slightly different disease. It's more an inflammatory disease of the nervous system, but we've made good progress there. Many cases of multiple sclerosis are now treatable and even can slow down progression completely. So we're making progress with Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, motor neuron disease, but it's about like cancer was 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. Next slide. And we need a palette of treatment options. The amyloid targeting therapies, as we've heard from Dana, are not cutting the mustard, although they may be more effective if used in the very early stages. And we're certainly developing drugs, new generation, if you like, anti-amyloid drugs that remove amyloid more quickly and with less side effects, such as the ARIA that Dana referred to. So just as in other now curable conditions, we're going to need a range of treatment options. We don't treat cancer usually with one drug. We don't treat rheumatoid arthritis or heart failure with one drug. Now, neuroinflammation, as Dana inferred, is now one of the darlings of current research. And we've seen this with drugs like semaglutide. Ozempic is one of its trade names. This is the GLP-1 receptor antagonist drugs. They do reduce dementia in the groups that they're currently used to treat, such as diabetics. So there's now specific studies to see if they'll reduce or slow down the progression of dementia in people who either already have that disease or at high risk of that disease. If these are found, if this drug is found successful, I see Xanamem, which has the name you see there, emestatistat, being used extensively. A small oral, relatively safe drug, very safe drug, we hope, I can see as being an important part of the palette. It'll be simple to use and it's oral. It gets over all those administrative issues that Dana referred to. And I think that's all I had to say. Next slide. So in conclusion, the Austin is typical of many large Alzheimer's research sites around the world. And we are tirelessly trialing new investigational products in Alzheimer's disease. As I said, the count now is well over 100 in our site alone, in over 200 trials. There are many potential targets, and Dana showed on the left of one of his earlier slides, there's probably about 15 targets. And we're going to have to look at all of those because the amyloid targeting therapies are not cutting the mustard, but they are now becoming extensively used. There's over 10,000 people at the last count that have had either lecanemab or donanemab in the 13 countries where they're approved. So the market, if you like, is ready, but we need safe, effective therapies to complement the anti-amyloid drugs. So thank you, Dana and Steve, and I'll hand back to our chair.
Well, thank you, Michael, for that summary, and it's impressive what Austin Health is doing and the variety of studies that you've carried out. So maybe I thought we would take a breather here and just have a couple of questions, discussions. So at the ADP meeting, and I know that you were also there, I was, surprised also that even the enthusiasts for amyloid and tau therapy recognize that we're going to have to add on different therapies now. And you mentioned that Alzheimer's disease is perhaps where cancer therapy was many years ago. So with a drug like Xanamem, how would you see that, maybe elaborate a little bit, how you would see that potentially therapeutically being used in the practice of neurology taking care of these patients?
So thanks, Dana. We have to first find out where it works. I mean, we're trying it now in people who have high phospho-tau, and they're going to be in a slightly more advanced stage, not the end stage by any means, but and not the late stage dementia. They're going to be used in people in the early stage of dementia, but a little more advanced than those who are just moving from mild cognitive impairment to dementia. Now, we need to see later on if this drug also works in earlier stages. We can't say that confidently yet. But let's say it is a drug that we reserve for people in the dementia stage of Alzheimer's. I think what I would see in the future is we'll use anti-amyloid, anti-tau, other neuroinflammation drugs, possibly in the very early stages, and then add drugs such as this small molecule at a later stage in the disease. But I see it's quite conceivable that everybody, in fact, potentially every one of those 150 million people around the world with, well, that's all dementia, but most of it is Alzheimer's disease. I can see eventually that all of those people would potentially benefit from this drug at some stage as their illness progresses. So I think this will be likely an add-on rather than an initial therapy, but incredibly important because it is not just a symptomatic drug. It does seem to be targeting underlying disease processes.
Yeah, I was impressed too at the meeting about the emerging profile of the antibodies, that they really don't work in patients that have manifest Alzheimer's disease, that more moderate. They really need to be given very early. And so you have a challenging risk benefit trade-off then, because you have a patient who's very early, there are side effects. I think presumably that impacts some of the patient's decision and the clinician's decisions to use them.
I think that's a really important point. If you're going to use a drug in even the preclinical stage that I referred to, when the pathology is building up, but there's not yet any symptoms, that drug has to be incredibly safe and ideally affordable and convenient to administer. And unfortunately, at this stage, the monoclonal antibodies, the amyloid targeting therapies, don't tick all those boxes. So we are going to need other options even in the earlier stages. Whether this drug works early, we have to see. But this first study is in people who are clearly in the dementia stages you've referred to.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned in passing some of the new technology for the amyloid antibodies, coupling them with a transferrin receptor, which is how your brain absorbs iron. And this whole area, I think, is going to be very interesting. And I think you've had some experience with some studies with that, or involved in some of those studies.
Yeah, we're involved in a study of trontinemab, which is a Roche study using a chemical very like gantenerumab, which unfortunately did not show enough clinical efficacy, but binding it to a transferrin receptor. So it gets into the brain in much larger amounts and through a different route to the other monoclonal antibodies such as lecanemab and donanemab. It does seem at this early stage to be very effective in removing amyloid, in most cases completely within 12 weeks. And also, it does seem to be associated with less side effects such as ARIA. But this is very early phase 1 work, and it's not yet published.
Yeah, so I think these are some of the examples for the listeners of how basic science and continually evolution of clinical research is really informing this field. It's moving us forward. We're now into second generation drugs with amyloid. We're now diversifying the targets and the mechanisms that we're attacking in the disease. And as I like to say, when I took care of patients, being a neurologist, taking care of the patients you're taking care of, that I've never taken care of a patient with a chronic disease that I've treated with one medicine. Typically it requires multiple medications in combination at different stages of the disease. And I would be willing to bet a nickel that's probably your experience too.
Well, it is. And I've mentioned heart disease, I've mentioned cancer, rheumatoid arthritis. Nobody gets one drug.
Yeah.
But other common conditions like hypertension, diabetes, they all now are treated with multiple medications, and appropriately so.
Yeah.
And Dana, I might just jump in with one question. We've got one
Yes,
question
please.
from the audience, and then we should probably move forward into Andy's
Sure.
presentation and take more Q&A at the end of that. But there's a question about sort of what percentage of potential Alzheimer's patients would fit the criteria of the current study, meaning what percentage have elevated p-tau 181? And I guess the related question there is, will you need to have an elevated p-tau 181 to get this drug when it's approved and commercialized? And I guess that's the related question.
Yeah, so these plasma biomarkers, p-tau 181, p-tau 217, and p-tau 235, and so forth, these are rapidly evolving and are, I think, in the very near future, going to supplant things like PET scanning to be the definitive biomarker confirmatory diagnoses for patients with Alzheimer's disease. And this is going to allow general clinicians, geriatricians, a broader group outside of psychiatrists and neurologists to actually diagnose patients and provide treatments, particularly if the treatments are potentially oral or safe and can be given at the early stage of disease. Unfortunately, right now, every patient with Alzheimer's disease is going to be going through the stage of patient that we are treating in our trial. We're treating patients with mild, moderate symptomatic Alzheimer's disease with a mini mental status of 18 to 26, which is the typical bedside test of cognition. So unfortunately, every patient will be at some point likely to go through that. The earlier stage of the disease that Professor Woodward was talking about, mild cognitive impairment, is a prodromal or very early stage, pre-Alzheimer's stage. And, as he mentioned, we'll have to determine whether Xanamem will work at that stage of the disease as well. Michael, if you had a comment.
Yeah, I think that's a very good answer. I mean, the bottom line is that at any one time, perhaps only 1/3 of people with symptomatic Alzheimer's disease will have a high phospho-tau, but everybody will eventually have a high phospho-tau.
Right.
Yeah, and the new drugs like lecanemab and donanemab have in their label from the FDA, at least, for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And so we believe it's relatively unlikely that the Xanamem approval would require any particular diagnostic blood test or PET scan or anything, right? Yeah. So we do have some other questions.
When you look at donanemab had both amyloid and tau PET scans, and that's not in their indication. So
yeah, cool. All right, we do have another question, but we'll save that to after Andy's presentation, I think. So maybe it's my pleasure to introduce Andy Udell, based on the East Coast, where Dana is also based, to tell us a bit about commercialization, why we're doing it, and how important it is.
Thank you, Steve, and good to be here with everyone. I think you can go to the next slide. For those that aren't aware that I haven't met, my background, I've been in the industry for well over 25 years now. Most of my career has been working with biotech companies that are in late stage development with their lead asset, helping them prepare for market and commercialization. And my biotech experience started with a large indication with a small biotech for an antidepressant. And most recently, I worked for a company where I launched and started with the company and took them through accelerated approval for a rare kidney disease. Next slide. All right, so you may be asking yourself, why commercial now? Why are they talking about commercial now? And the simple answer is, without the input prior to phase 3, you risk two key things. Number one is appropriate market access, and we're going to talk about these a little bit in detail. And number two is delaying your launch, which are both things that you don't want to do, especially when you're in our position. Some things to think about. Commercial isn't just sales and marketing. A lot of people think that it's It's those things, and those come late in the process, in the commercialization process. Every product is unique. You have to truly understand the benefits in your product. It's essential, and you have to know your product better than anyone else. The earlier the input, the better. You see large pharmaceutical companies, they have a full staff of commercial people, and they'll pull someone over, or they'll pull a team or a couple of people over to assess a market, to assess the potential, and they'll take that under advice when designing clinical trials. It takes a long time to do it optimally. Okay, there are things that take several months. There are things that take over a year, and you have to start some of those things earlier in the process than after you get approval. And the good news is Actinogen's leadership is very experienced. I think that they've gone through this process, and they valued the input of commercial early, and I'm here. So that's good. So next slide. So as you can see here, Xanamem is obviously in late stage. We were talking about this, and the commercial provides great impact. I mean, there is, like I said, a lot of companies, smaller companies, do not have commercial input early, and you can't go back and change your phase 3 afterwards. And so to get an approval for a drug that you can't get market access for and get to the appropriate patients is a problem. And so if you design trials and think about things that you can do ahead of time to meet the needs of decision makers and stakeholders appropriately, you'll have the best success in the future. And once again, also, when companies look to partner this, and companies look to gain partnership with other companies, they want to see this input. They want to understand the product. They may even want to have some input in some of these later stage trials. And that's why the typical partnering process is in this area that we're talking about here. Next slide. So where do we begin? What do we do first? So if you go to the next slide, the key is to first understand your market and all the stakeholders. You can't assume or believe everything you hear. You have to validate. I've joined companies or spoke to companies that they're small. They have a functional area expertise and very bright people in one discipline or two disciplines, and they rely on information from, let's say, a few KOLs. Maybe those KOLs aren't actually treating patients. They're brilliant people that understand the disease and the science behind it, but they might not be the right people to assess a market. So you really have to know your unique asset, and you have to understand and validate all the information you get. There are other tricks and things or challenges. Xanamem is a unique asset that has potential in several therapeutic areas. And so you may be doing your research and speaking to stakeholders in a therapeutic area, and one area might answer the same question different than a different therapeutic area. So you have to consider these things and focus on your market as well. You have to understand the size of your market, okay? You have to understand the patient journey. Some diseases, rare diseases, are diagnosed too late. Look, we're talking about Alzheimer's disease, and we're talking about earlier treatments, but how is it going to get diagnosed with people? It's usually when it's symptomatic that you start to get the diagnosis, and sometimes it is too late for certain treatments to stop things. You have to look at the standard of care today, and that's where a lot of times, especially in the US, market access takes place, because if they don't see it as a huge advance and you haven't designed your trials and to demonstrate benefits, sometimes the standard of care will still be required to be tried prior to your product. You have to certainly look in the pipeline. You have to see what's coming down the pipe, and you have to constantly monitor that throughout the process as you're going through, because markets can change. Okay, and is it a satisfied market? If not, what are the unmet needs of the patients, the physicians, and the payers? And these are key stakeholders that if you don't address each of them, you can have problems. Next slide, please. So understanding our markets. So you look at Alzheimer's disease, I think it's been discussed already, and people are very familiar that this is a very large market with large unmet need, as you heard earlier in our discussions here. The prevalence, as they discussed, is dementias is very large, and certainly Alzheimer's disease is the majority of those patients. And you see the prevalence in the U.S. and in Australia, big numbers. It has fluctuated between the 6th and 7th leading cause of death amongst older people in the U.S. And I think these are things that people know and have been validated, and it's been very well studied and characterized in this market. And obviously the limited efficacy and the few available treatments makes it a very unsatisfied and large market. You go to the next slide. So we look at the pipeline, and I think it was discussed earlier, the pipeline. There are not too many unique approaches that are certainly not in later stages and have had success. We talked about the amyloid hypothesis and the efficacy, and a lot of the things in the pipeline are undifferentiated. They may, as Dr. Woodward said, speed up, and they may have benefits and benefit the patients, but they're not differentiated enough on the efficacy that they're going to cure or have substantial greater benefits for patients. The anti-tau products virtually have all already failed in the clinic. And then we talked a little bit earlier, you heard about the GLP-1s, and it's a heavily anticipated trial, a large trial that's coming out in Q4 this year. And while we've begun to test and hypothesize how that would impact things, and in some areas it's a positive for our product, in some areas it may change the market, this is something you'll need to test and understand how it's going to shake up the category, and you need to continue to test these things as you move forward. What's clear is there's no silver bullet in development, and as was discussed also extensively, this is a chronic disease that will likely take several different treatments used concomitantly to treat the uniqueness of the patients in this disease. Next slide. When we look at the major depressive disorder, also a very large market. Okay, you see the numbers there, and it's a very unsatisfied market. But I want to say it's a very different market, right? This is a market that, while it's costing billions of dollars to the system, there have been a lot of products and approvals that we've probably all heard for years, decades now, and many more get approved. And so the problem there is the efficacy of these products, but it's a different dynamic. Patients are siphoning through and changing products. And so it leads you to say, well, why do we need new products, and what's going to happen? And if you go to the next slide, it's not satisfied, as we said, and there's been a recent launch in the U.S. over the last couple of years of Auvelity, a combination product, not that unique as far as the active ingredients. Yet in year 2, the second full year, did over $290 million on the market. So it is a unsatisfied market. There are many niches and different ways to approach it. There's add-on therapies. There's something called treatment-resistant depression, which is patients that have failed on 2 lines of antidepressants. So there are many opportunities in this large and unsatisfied market. Next slide. So important. We need to understand our product. You need to understand your product better than anyone else. How does it work? How is it unique? What unmet needs does our product address for each stakeholder that you are looking at? What are their perceptions when we go into market now, right? We don't have the clinical results, the end result. We don't have the label. So you start to look at your target product profile, and you try to understand how people will benefit based on the different outcomes that could happen. Are you facing any pre-existing beliefs in the market? Has there been failures with similar mechanisms? Have there, anything that could be pre-existing? Is there a product that's been tried that's been similar to this in a different market? So you have to address these and understand it. What is easily understood and what isn't? Do you have to explain the mechanism of action of your product? Is it brand new? Is it a new chemical entity? And these are kind of things you have to understand, because in order for people to uptake, and in order for a physician to want to prescribe or understand to prescribe if it's an appropriate product for their patients, they have to understand this, and they have to be well versed in the nuances of the product. In addition, payers need to understand this to understand if they're going to reimburse and pay for your product. If they don't understand why it's different, how it works differently, they're going to push it off, and they're going to put up barriers to market access. And patients are going to want to take the product. They just need to understand. There's the internet now where everyone's looking up every drug and wants to understand it. So there's things that they're going to have to understand before they're going to want to even take your product. Next slide. There are additional challenges that you must prepare for. Market access, very, very impactful now. Products are very different, right? There's some products that are mass available, they're generally marketed, they're in every pharmacy. There are other products that are specialty pharmacy products, right? They're smaller markets, and so these products can't be found in every pharmacy, and there's a different method on how that product gets from the manufacturer into the patient's mouth and how they get the product. There's also patient services. Some of these products have very high requirements and levels. The bar is pretty high as far as the services you must provide patients just to get your product. You have to look at the existing marketed products as well as those in development, as we talked about. Treatment guidelines, believe it or not, can be a barrier. There are some times where there are existing guidelines, and a payer, for example, will cite those guidelines until you're in these guidelines. They'll put a barrier up instead of to help make it more difficult to get your product. And sometimes you have to look at how to obtain or administer treatments different. Once again, referring back to specialty products, not found in every pharmacy. You might have to order it, might have to be taken at the physician's office. There are different ways and things that you have to consider when you're looking at your product. Next slide. So what have we learned so far for us? So we've begun, since I've joined the company, we've really started to understand our audience and get their reactions to Xanamem through qualitative market research. Okay, we have a target product profile, and we conducted qualitative market research with many physicians. We've had one-on-one meetings with key opinion leaders in Alzheimer's disease. We've had major depressive disorder advisory boards, and we've learned a lot in this. And the keys that we've learned, the first thing that's most important is we need to focus on our novel mechanism of action. This really, when we have these interactions, this really seems to pique the interest of our audience. They're curious. They want to understand the mechanism of action, what makes it different. They want a reason to believe it's going to work, and they have to understand it. Secondary to that, but also extremely important, is the data to date. We've got some great PET data, clinical results in biomarker confirmed AD patients, and the things that Dana talked about earlier, as well as the MDD results. These all support the success and differentiation, or the likelihood of success and differentiation for the product as we start to move forward. So go to the next slide. So one of the first things that we wanted to do, and this is hot off the presses, this is the first public viewing of a video to explain our MOA. And what's important about doing this is to have consistency in message. And so this helps have consistency to explain our mechanism of action, and I'll let you listen for yourself and watch for yourself.
Alzheimer's disease is defined by the pathology of amyloid plaques and tau tangles. However, targeting these proteins has had mixed therapeutic success. Research suggests chronic excess cortisol, the stress hormone, plays an important pathological role upstream of neurodegeneration. Elevated brain cortisol levels are strongly linked to Alzheimer's disease and major depressive disorder, disrupting brain cell metabolism and damaging neurons through excessive synapse pruning and impairing neurogenesis. Over 50% of brain cortisol is generated locally by the enzyme 11-beta-HSD1, which converts inactive cortisone into active cortisol. 11-beta-HSD1 is highly expressed in brain regions critical for memory and mood, and its levels increase with Alzheimer's and depression. Xanamem, emustadostat, readily crosses the blood-brain barrier and is the first and only potent oral inhibitor of brain 11-beta HSD1. By selectively reducing cortisol in key brain regions, Xanamem is designed to slow Alzheimer's and treat depression while maintaining adrenal production and normal plasma cortisol levels, avoiding adrenal insufficiency. Additionally, its action in the liver and adipose tissue may provide anti-inflammatory and metabolic benefits. In summary, Phase 2 clinical trials have shown Xanamem to be safe and well tolerated, with promising disease-modifying activity in Alzheimer's disease and improvement in depressive symptoms.
So as you can see, this is a video, or an animation, I should say, that's really meant for several audiences. You'll see this we'll play this at conventions, we'll have this during interactions and presentations, but I think it's important to provide that base and that reason to believe and understand how the product works. So what's next until the clinical trial readout? Well, we're going to continue to use this mechanism of action video and have our interactions with KOLs and different relative stakeholders. We'll continue to monitor market. We're going to have an increased presence at all relevant congresses and conferences, and we will be, moving things forward in an appropriate pace and manner, which may mean assessing things and doing additional market research based on how things progress and key milestones within the market. So with that, I think I'm going to conclude and just summarize things that we are preparing for success. You have to prepare for success. You have to move forward and plan for this success. Otherwise, as I said at the beginning, you risk having limited market access or delaying a launch should you gain approval. You have to know your market and all the stakeholders. You have to understand your product, exactly how it's going to benefit, how it's unique, and how it's going to work. And you have to design these final stages of the clinical trial programs to optimize this prescribing information and the market access that you're going to gain at launch. So the time to prepare for this commercialization is now, as we said earlier. So with that, I think we'll open up to questions.
Yes, and just as a reminder, I know we're only a few minutes from the top of the hour, but if you have a new question, please type it in the Q&A icon and press enter, and we'll attempt to answer those as quickly as possible. I will answer a couple of them just quickly to save time. I think the second question we got was about promising non-amyloid Alzheimer's drugs that are in a similar stage of development. I think you covered that, Andy. I mean, really, GLP-1s are the main category where we just don't know whether they're going to work or not, but they could be relevant. But those drugs aren't suitable for all Alzheimer's patients. And there really aren't good-looking other small molecules that we think of as direct competitors. A questioner asked if I'm both a shareholder of ACW and was diagnosed with early Alzheimer's last year. How do you get on a new trial or treatment? And obviously, if you're interested in the Xanamem trial of our drug, you just go to our website and there's a link there to take you to a screening page. But Michael, maybe you would comment, what's the best place to go if you're an Australian patient looking for a choice of trials?
It depends on where you are, of course, but if you're in the Melbourne region, we'd love to see you at our centre, and happy to take an email, which I'll refer on to our recruitment officer, who's a nurse. But there's, as I said, as you said, 15 sites around Australia, and you just have to contact those various sites. Unfortunately, Dementia Australia are not particularly helpful in identifying particular sites, so it's better to go through the actual website of the company that's conducting the trials. In this case, as you said, Stephen, your site. But yep. I'm very happy for someone to contact me at the Austin if they're in Australia.
And certainly, my email address is all over our website. Myself or Michael Roberts, very happy to take any questions and offer any help via email as well.
Plus full contact details, Steve, in the last slide for Michael, yes, and ourselves.
Very good. Thank you. Brendan mentioned that Edison focuses the research report focuses on the US and EU markets, but how do you think about China and India? I don't know, Andy, would you like to have a go at that one?
I think we think about those markets sometimes with regional partners, and we don't have the internal expertise a lot of times with foreign markets, and so we look at other partners. That's why we have a lot of these discussions. That usually helps assist with the local know-how, whether it be regulatory or clinical, and what's going to make a product succeed there. So we do look at that, and we are contacted by companies for regional partnerships.
Yeah, thanks for that. And there's another question about whether we're planning to do a full global launch ourselves, and I guess I'll take a stab at that one. The simple answer is no. We're a highly competent, highly skilled clinical and commercial development team. However, if, as we anticipate, the Xanamem trial is strongly positive, we'll be working with regulators and other global and regional pharmaceutical companies to hopefully optimize and speed the path to market in all markets. Because if this truly is, something like akin to the Holy Grail for Alzheimer's, or part of that Holy Grail story, perhaps in combination with another medication, yes, it would take us too long and to build out a big sales team ourselves. So for areas like China, we'd be looking for a company to partner with that either had a regional specialty focus in China and South Korea, for example, or a global company that already had that geographic coverage. So a related question about regulators: the TGA seems to be delaying introduction of a new product. This is from Brett. Why? And Brett, I think you're referring to the recent failure of the monoclonal antibodies to amyloid getting approved in Australia. Gossip has it that one company at least was offered a very narrow label and declined to take that. So I don't know, Michael, whether you want to comment on that.
So the drug that didn't accept the small narrow window or narrow range of conditions that you referred to, that was lecanemab of the company Eisai. Donanemab, there hasn't been a decision yet, but watch this space. The TGA decision is expected in the next 2 weeks. And there's some of us who think it'll go the same way, some of us who think it'll have more success than lecanemab. But in combination, lecanemab and donanemab have been approved in now approaching 20 countries around the world. So I think Australia will come on board at some stage. Wait and see. It's a bit surprising because normally the world takes its lead from Australia. I think in this case, Australia might have to take its lead from the world, but we'll see.
Yeah, and Brett, I think the TGA is charged with not just assessing the risks and benefits and thus the risk-benefit ratio of any new therapy. There is also a bit of an overlay about the potential costs to the system for a new expensive therapy, and also the costs of the scans needed for monitoring and so forth. So it's kind of a complicated system question as well as just the benefits and merits of the drugs themselves. So I agree with Michael. I think that the TGA will come around with probably lots of limitations on exactly how it can be prescribed to sort of control the initial use of the products.
And the market won't be huge because while it's not on the PBAC, the cost of these drugs is, we know from overseas, is going to be around about $40,000 per year.
Yeah. And then we have an interesting question from Andrew about, who said, I have a mother who is showing the same signs as her mother, who also had Alzheimer's disease. Having talks with my mother is challenging, even with GP input. Having some sort of easy, definitive test will help this battle. So sort of be asking a question around the diagnostics that are coming. Dana already mentioned p-tau, but Michael, you might have another perspective on the future of diagnostics.
Well, I mean, it's still important to try and have a clinical diagnosis, not just rely on a blood test. So it's true that if p-tau tests, such as particularly p-tau 213, become widely available, then that's a good start. But you're still going to have to convince your mother to go and see an appropriate doctor. We're never going to make a diagnosis of Alzheimer's entirely on a blood test. You've got to have a clinical diagnosis as well. So I would not wait for the blood test. I would try and get your mother to see a memory clinic or an appropriate specialist.
Yep, terrific. Thank you. So we are at the top of the hour, and I know, Michael, you've got another meeting to go to, and I think it's been an excellent session. So unless Andy and Dana, you have any closing comments you'd like to make, then I would thank everybody for attending. Thank all of the attendees out there interested in what we've presented today. Thank you, Michael, very much for being a part of it. Very important and exciting to have your participation and for us to be discussing what hopefully really is the upslope and the beginning of a new era in Alzheimer's treatments. And we very much hope that Xanamem will be an important part of that. So thank you, everybody.